Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to CitySpace.
You pay attention with so much at stake.
Seas are rising and chronic flooding will be the new normal.
You navigate, you listen, you keep an ear out. You pay attention, and so do we. We tell the stories of our time every day.
In the 26th day of testimony and on the 139th witness, Shahar Tsarnaev wept.
We unearth what would otherwise stay hidden.
There's just a lot of hate in this world, and that day, for that hour, we were humans.
Across the street.
The Red Sox have won the World Series.
And around the globe.
It's here and now.
This is modern love.
This is WBUR's All Things Considered.
This is only a game.
This is on.
And on stage in the heart of Boston.
I'm Jack Lepore. Welcome to WBUR CitySpace.
Always looking forward, paying attention, and knowing that your story is one of our stories.
Good morning. I'm Bob Oates.
I'm Lisa Mullins.
I'm Meghna Chakrabarty.
I'm Jeremy Hobson.
This is 90.9 WBUR, Boston.
With the great minds we hear on WBUR and read on WBUR.org, and have an in-person experience which enriches us and our city. That was my dream. So tonight, if you will indulge me, is sort of surreal. Have you ever awakened from a dream and experienced that sense of disappointment that it wasn't real? It was just conjured up in your sleep? Well, this is the opposite of that. I have a sense of euphoria and gratitude that this dream was not a mirage. It was not buried in my sleep. It was, in fact, a real journey made possible by so many people who believe in the work of WBUR and the importance of public conversation to make our city and our lives better. Today, WBUR has a civic home in Boston. A convening space where we can come together to meet the brilliant thinkers, artists, academics, politicians, business leaders, doctors, and scientists who shape our world and challenge us to create a brighter future for ourselves and for our children and our grandchildren. That is the work of CitySpace and the commitment of WBUR to this city we love. Such a dream does not become a reality without enormous support of a community of believers. Let me thank some very special people. First, Jeannie and Jonathan Levine, whose extraordinary generosity prompted us to name our broadcast center in their honor. Also, Josh and Anita Beckenstein and the Barr Foundation, whose name graces our stage. John and Margot Davis, for whom this hall is named, Paul and Patty Gannon, Mimi Jagarjian, Penny and Bruns Grayson, Ron O'Hanley, Bill Kalatis, Liz and Phil Gross, and many others whose names you can find on our beautiful donor wall in the lobby of CitySpace. Of course, there are also countless people at WBUR who helped make CitySpace a reality, and I want to publicly thank three of them. Carl Volker, my partner in designing and building CitySpace, managed this project and whose loving attention to detail is so evident to me in the floors and windows and walls and every inch of CitySpace. Mary Hull, my partner in spreading the word of our vision and raising millions of dollars to build and program CitySpace. And finally, Amy McDonald, who, along with her team, will fill CitySpace with countless magical nights that will inspire and move us. Thank you all for making CitySpace come to life. Now I am happy to introduce to you two of my favorite people, Howard and Freddie Stevenson. Freddie accepted my request 8 years ago to be my first chair of the board of WBUR. She guided me, supported me, and inspired me to think big and build a sustainable future for this precious institution. Howard, who is also on the board of WBUR, lent me his exceptional expertise from raising more than $1 billion for Harvard Business School to create the very first campaign in the history of WBUR. As many of you know, Howard literally wrote the book on fundraising, and I used it like a Bible. Howard has also guided me in building the case for our $40 million campaign, and Howard and Freddie have also been extraordinarily generous supporters and helped to make CitySpace a reality. Tonight, Howard and Freddie will bring you the latest news on our campaign and share some thoughts about our hopes for the future. Ladies and gentlemen, Freddie and Howard Stevenson.
Thank you, Charlie. It's your vision and leadership that has brought us to this inflection point as we celebrate the opening of CitySpace. When you laid out your vision of FutureCast, everyone liked something, but few of us had the vision of such an ambitious future for WBUR. Your persistence and ability to rally the troops is seriously amazing. I'm a faithful daily listener with lots of driveway moments. We are living in a time of rapid and constant change in our world and in the ways people receive and consume information. Journalism is in the crisis mode. 15,000 journalists have lost their jobs, and even more have become spokespersons for a point of view rather than faithful professionals, giving us the facts and letting us draw our conclusions. Having served on as board chair for 3 years, I want to acknowledge the progress that we have made as a board through Paul Gannon's leadership. Times are never easy, but great leadership makes things possible. Paul has shown what can be done. We're waiting for Robin and Jill Lepore. Therefore, without further words, I'd like to introduce my husband, Howard Stevenson, who will be more specific about an ask.
Well, we stand between you and a good talk. Freddie, in 2003, encouraged me to get involved in NPR down in Washington first. And this has been a very exciting ride, as you can imagine. Tonight, I'm going to announce great news and some challenging news. Obviously, BR has been in the quiet phase of capital campaign. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the building. We've also already raised 70% of the goal of $40 million. That's clearly great news. So I won't ask you for the first $28 million. The bad news is there's still $12 million still to raise. Freddie and I are honored to contribute and to serve as co-chairs of the campaign, along with Corey and Anya Thomas, John and Margot Davis, Paul and Patty Gannon, and Bill Kalados. We don't kid ourselves, however, that without Charlie and Mary Hull, the whole BUR team, the venture won't succeed. More importantly, without your support, it won't succeed either. You ask, why am I asking? The organization's raised $28 million. By the way, that's larger than the initial goal you talked about, as I remember. It's meeting its annual fundraising goals, and it's very well managed. The answer is there's some things we need to do to continue to serve you. It's not for the organization, it's to serve you and the consumers of our content. I think all of us are here because we think we need WBUR. Right now, we have to partner with the community to ensure that what we know and love continues to innovate provide new content in new formats, and builds upon this magnificent space to create connections and to bridge differences. Great journalism requires both new and expensive content, like investigative journalism, state house reporting, and environmental and cultural reporting. If you're privileged to be here last night to talk about the environment, that's something I care a lot about, and I learned a lot, even though I thought I knew everything, but then I was a professor at Harvard. At the same time, we have to provide what you want, when you want it, where you want it, and how you want it. Thank goodness this organization, compared to most public radio stations, is building on great strength. We need to innovate, and it requires us to embrace the opportunities of the digital age, whether it's via podcast, live streaming, social media, and more. We need to invest in the people, the skills, evolving technology, and risk-taking. We may not get it right, but we don't have $1 billion of market cap to pay for it. CitySpace will be only bricks, equipment, and mortar, or maybe it's concrete, I haven't checked, unless great programming creates many-to-many interactions to help us bridge differences. We aspire to make it Boston's home for intellectual expression and civic conversations. We are very fortunate to have great talent in this community and this region. But now the challenge is to engage you and others effectively. How do you want it? How do we make these more interesting to you? There's a price tag for filling our community needs. As we mentioned, we're seeking $12 million. $3.5 million is to program CitySpace, $3 million is to expand and innovate in local journalism, and $5.5 million is to expand to carry the station into the future through innovation. And by the way, that's both anticipated. We don't know what we're going to need in 5 years. Just think back that time. So there may be some serendipity involved. I hope you're here because you appreciate what BUR does for you and our community. We know there's campaign fatigue. I checked, I think I know of 45 different capital campaigns going on in Boston. I think I'm on the list of most. Because every organization wants more. But you know how important it is to build on more informed, empowered, and inspired public. WBUR is a powerhouse in the public media world, but it's a small player in the media landscape. Think about Facebook, Google, and Fox. I mean, don't think about them, actually. I served as chair of NPR in Washington, and out of that I learned we can only succeed if we have strong local stations supported by community investment and innovative thinking. We will achieve our mutual goals. I hope you share those goals with us. Please join Freddie and me in reaching as deep as pockets as you can to create the future you deserve. There are many people out there with deep pockets and short arms. Please don't be one. So Charlie will now introduce our featured guests so we can experience the magic of CitySpace.
Thank you, Howard and Freddie. So, Jill Lepore is an American historian and the David Woods Kemper Professor of American History at Harvard University. But if you are like me, you know her mostly from her brilliant writing for The New Yorker, where she has been a staff writer since 2005. I first saw Jill Lepore at an event at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester in 2010. She was speaking, with the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Jim Leach, who was on a civil discourse tour of the country. Now that may be even more important now than it was in 2010. I remember being utterly amazed by Jill Lepore's brilliance, her exceptional capacity to speak to the crowd in a compelling and engaging way, and to articulate completely original thinking. Jill is the author of a new book, These Truths, A History of the United States. It's a big book. I think it's close to 900 pages, and I admit that I'm only on page 250 because I am reading it slowly and savoring it. This book is a must-read for all of us. Talking to Jill tonight is one of the truly wonderful journalists and hosts in all of public radio, our own Robin Young. Robin and I go back to our days at WBZ-TV, where she was an evening magazine. I was at a different part of the station. I have followed her storied career from Boston to New York, across the country, and back to Boston. I could not be more delighted to listen to Robin every day as she hosts Here and Now, reaching more than 5 million people a week on 500 public radio stations. Robin Young is one of the greatest interviewers in all of public radio, and we are so proud to work with her at WBUR and to welcome her to the CitySpace stage. Ladies and gentlemen, Jill Lepore and Robin Young.
Charlie, when you first came and we had sort of the very first talk that we had in this space, I said, Charlie, it would be so great if we had a place where we could bring people in. We're all so separated now. We're all on our phones and our FaceTime and our Facebook, and we're not seeing each other. And we go out, and we still will do this. We go out and we host events for the Kennedy Library, the Museum of Science, and all these wonderful nonprofits that we love in this city. But why don't we have this here? And you did it. This is Charlie Kravitz's baby, and I just want you to applaud him again for this space and what he did. What he did. And then you just said to me, this reminds me of something. This is what it's like to hang out with Jill Lepore. This reminds me of something, and you went where?
Oh, the Lyceum movement of the 19th century. A little town had a Lyceum, and the speakers would come through town, and your Sylvester Graham would come along and tell you to live off of graham crackers, and the next week an abolitionist would come along. and this is the modern Lyceum. Yeah.
I was thinking the graham cracker guy too. So it's just so much fun to see you here because we've been able to speak a lot as well, and so we hope that you are a frequent visitor here. You can talk about whatever you want. But here's the book. How many have read it? Oh, good. Oh, good. Part of it. Oh, good. So we're going to, good. And what I want to do as well is I want to mash up some, what I think is the thread in this book, and you tell me, with a recent article that you wrote for The New Yorker that begins, if any of you have read it, with her on the back of a Woody station wagon delivering newspapers with her dad in Worcester. And you're going to see how George Washington has something to do with Worcester. We're gonna make that happen.
We're gonna reclaim Worcester.
Yeah, we're gonna do that. So the book begins with an opening page with a quote from Lincoln. "We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we will save our country." And I've been thinking, disenthrall. I'd like to disenthrall myself from technology. From what did he mean?
Yeah, he meant the petty hatreds of the day, right? The sort of the frozen positions, the brittleness, we would say the judginess, the intractability,
the Twitter,
the Twitter of the day. Yeah, Lincoln just floors me. I'm just so moved by Lincoln. Lincoln would have also loved this space, a great public orator. I just want to say it is so thrilling to be here for all the reasons that Charlie mentioned and that you've mentioned. I remember the first time I'm going to get back to Lincoln, but the first time I came to BUR I was a college student, and I came to volunteer for the fund drive to answer phones. And
God bless you.
Had worked super hard to get the slot, the Car Talk slot, the coveted Car Talk slot, so I could meet Tom and Ray. And it was like the most exciting thing of my entire college experience. But I remember biking over here, and I'm like, where is it? So this is good. This is super thrilling. Right, so what I loved about that Lincoln, just it's a kind of a welcome, it's an invocation, like, you know what? Relax. We're going to get disenthralled. I'm so grateful for, and this is a thing that I am grateful to NPR and to BUR for every day, to do the work of pause. Like, hold on. Let's pull back. Let's think about this. Let's not rush to judgment. Let's not immediately tweet. Let's, not click on yes, here's my petition. And that was something that Lincoln was calling his fellow citizens to do as in that moment.
So appropriate now. I'd like you to, can you read the first paragraph?
Sure.
This is the very opening paragraph of your introduction.
Okay. The course of history is unpredictable, as irregular as the weather, as errant as affection, nations rising and falling by whim and chance, battered by violence, corrupted by greed, seized by tyrants, raided by rogues, addled by demagogues. This was all true October 30th, 1787, when readers of a newspaper called the New York Packet found on the front page an advertisement for an almanac that came bound with tables predicting the rising and setting of the sun, the judgment of the weather, the length of days and nights, and as a bonus, something entirely new, the Constitution of the United States. 4,400 words that attempted to chart the motions of the branches of government and the separation of their powers as if these were matters of physics, like the transit of the sun and moon and the comings and goings of the tides. It was meant to mark the start of a new era in which the course of history might be made predictable and a government established that would be ruled not by accident and force, but by reason and choice. The origins of that idea and its fate are the story of American history.
Let us pray. So beautiful. You know, you go on to say, I mean, what I love is that right there in the first paragraph, the way the colonists, Americans, wanted to live was bound up in the way we talk to each other and deliver news, the newspaper. You know, right there at the beginning, the media, the way you get your information, tied up with the goal for the country. And you write, the free people in the US were asked to consider this thing they found folded in their newspaper as they went about baling hay, milling corn, tanning leather, singing hymns, letting the seams out on last year's winter coats for parents grown fatter, kids grown taller. History preserved like baby teeth in a jar in the 4 parchment sheets of that Constitution and in hundreds of newspapers where arguments for and against appeared alongside shipping news. A, writing your ass off here, but B, talk more about, I mean, that's right at the beginning, this idea, you bundled it together, how information gets out and how meaningful it was.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting because the story that I decided in the end to open the book with, which, I mean, it has to be this kind of big, sprawling, audacious claim, right? It has to do a lot of work, the opening. And I fell back on something that I used in teaching. So when I would teach the Federalist Papers, which is the set of 85 essays that advocates of the Constitution wrote to try to convince people to vote for it, because it was a really close call, the students would sort of kind of gloss over. They'd be like, well, I mean, the essays are pretty hard. And it's not, I'm not Lin-Manuel Miranda. Like, I'm not going to get up there and perform Hamilton. Like, it's a little tough to, and I mean, I'm so stirred by the Federalist Papers. Like, I get so excited. But there was something about the immediacy of the decision that was like the urgency of like, look, the thing is, this is the first time in the history of the world where people framed a government for themselves and then they presented it to the people to vote and ratify. Like, that really is stunning. I mean, we have a lot of criticism about the Constitution. I don't want to, sacralize it, worship it, but I want to think carefully about what it means. So I did this thing one year, which was I made these giant facsimiles of the New York Packet, which is one of the first newspapers where the Constitution had appeared and where the first Federalist paper was printed. And so I made like facsimile 18th century newspapers. So it's, a single sheet. I used like 11 and a half, really fantastically complicated Kinko's job. And, it's hard to read because the S's are F's. And I went into the class one day and I just handed them out. And I said, your job, we're going to read the paper for a few minutes. And this was recently enough that most of my students had never read a physical paper anyway. So it was already super, give me a piece of paper. Yeah. It was already incredibly exotic. But so there's this room and they're just like, what do I even do with it? Like, what do I open it? Like, where's the, and, I'm not making fun of the students are fantastic. It's just, it's puzzling, it's baffling to look at an 18th century paper because it doesn't even look like a modern paper. And so I asked them to read it, and they eventually see that there's an advertisement. I just call out, like, tell me what you see, and we read the paper together. And it's a whole world. Like you're immediately immersed in a world where people want to know what ship's going to be in port that day. And if I wanted to buy molasses, which dock would I go to? And then they come across the Federalist Papers where Alexander Hamilton says, look, this is the choice of the American people. It has fallen to the American people to make this decision, whether in future governments people can rule themselves by reflection and choice, or whether like every other people in the history of the world, we are fated to be ruled by accident and force. And they read that and it's soaring, and then they look across to page 3, that's on page 2, and there's an advertisement for a Negro wench with a nursing babe. Inquire at the printer, which is also where you were supposed to go to get your extra copies of the Constitution. And when they first see that, then the room just changes, because the whole idea that you could understand American history only by looking at page 2 or only by looking at page 3 is just revealed. Sorry.
No, that's so quite all right.
I'm into my prop. It's just revealed to be a lie. And so it's suddenly like they also see journalism actually makes this community a conversation and even reveals to us things that people didn't even want to see, but that are chronicled in that paper.
Well, and what I love about being reminded of this and all of your writing of early American history is it's astonishing how blind, you can still have good journalism and it can be blind to something. It was quite a reminder, like there's something we're maybe not seeing now, even as journalists. But what it was important to you in this book, you've said, to take the things that used to be the sidebars in history books and put them right front and center. So the voices of women. I mean, you're known for this, writing not about Ben Franklin, but his sister. And we're going to skip around. We are not going to start with Columbus in Haiti. We're not going to do that, but I urge you all to do that. But let's just skip around. And for instance, the story that you tell of James Madison, he's in Philadelphia. It's 1782. He's been serving in the Continental Congress. He goes to Philadelphia. He has to go back to Virginia. And he writes his father and says, I'm really worried because I brought a slave with me. And how are you going to keep him down on the farm? Tell that story.
Yeah. So Madison, of course, is the guy who drafted the Constitution, the father of the Constitution. And he's been serving in Congress, and ever since he left Virginia, he has brought an enslaved man with him who has been his property since they were both children. And he only refers to him as Billy. And they've been living in Philadelphia, which is where Congress was meeting at the time. And Pennsylvania has passed an abolition law where you cannot you cannot sell people as property any longer in Pennsylvania. This is part of the revolutionary spirit of the late decades of the 18th century. But Virginia still has slavery, and Madison's packing his bags, and he really does not know what to do. And he writes about this to his father at some length, because if he brings Billy back to Virginia, he's like, Billy actually believes in liberty. Like, he doesn't believe in this system any longer. He's been living, almost like like a paid wage. And he will bring this infectious spirit of liberty to Montpelier, which is the Madison family plantation.
The spirit of liberty.
That's just led to. And so he doesn't want to do that because their plantation will become a slave rebellion. And he doesn't know what to do, and he can't legally sell him. And he's really puzzled by it. And he says, he says reflectively, I also have to say, he's right. I mean, freedom is good. Like, he has been listening to us all sit around in the evening in the boarding house talking about liberty.
Saying this.
Yeah, he understands that Billy is right. And yet he still can't understand how wrong the institution is, and he comes up with this, ridiculous solution, which is he sells Billy into indentured servitude, which is legal, a period of 7 terms, and then he becomes William Gardner, and he marries a free black woman who is Thomas Jefferson's laundress. Like, they live in this whole other kind of like Downton Abbey like version of the 18th century that we don't pay much attention to, and that you have to think about then how carefully Madison's biographers and historians writing about the Constitution have erased Billy. Right? Those people read those letters. Those letters have been in Madison's papers since forever. They've been published for decades. He was scrubbed out of American history. So people are like, well, where did you find all these people? Like, they've been there. They were alive then. Like, they lived and died, So the work is just undoing the whitewashing. But but it makes you think about just how much work was done to produce a particular version of the American story.
A couple things. Why don't we? I've always wondered this. Why don't we want to see this? Why don't we tell these stories? Why are we glued to Masterpiece Theater? Yeah. But we don't have our own. I mean, we are inching towards that with Little Women, you know, finally made its way. Into, but why?
You know, I think there are complicated answers to that question. And I also think that until this year's Academy Award nominations, or maybe even last year's, you know, it was often pointed out that the only films that actually are made about African American people, like as a people, are about slavery, which is itself its own problem, right? They're not a kind of multifocal vantage that actually looks at the institution from all angles and sides, or we don't really have a lot of film about Jim Crow. I mean, we don't. The kind of female character-driven stories, that's on Hollywood. I mean, that is just on those guys. They sit in those rooms and they make those decisions. But I mean, we are actually drawn to certain kinds of stories that were mythologized in the 19th century. So we have a kind of Last of the Mohicans weird romanticization of Native Americans as like this disappearing people. We have the 19th century writers were obsessed with the Salem witchcraft trials. So we have these, like, which were not actually important at all. I mean, very disappointing for New Englanders, but like actually historically not especially significant. So there's a weird kind of patchiness, a very unevenness to it.
Can you, even as Jill Lepore, who has marinated in all of this for so many years, were there some of those anecdotes, those little stories? I mean, it's dizzying. Yes, we start with the 4 words from Columbus as he saw Haitians, or as he called them, Hispaniolians, for the first time. We saw naked people. Then it's you flip 147 pages in, and suddenly we're at Washington's bedside. He's dying, and there are more black people in the room than white. And then you flip to page 443. It's 1938. We've gone through all that history. It's 1938. The House Un-American Activities Committee is formed. One of my heroes, the reporter Dorothy, first American journalist to be kicked out of Nazi Germany. Time magazine said she was as influential as Eleanor Roosevelt. Writes of the committee. I love this. She writes of the House Un-American Activities Committee, I learn in your book, little men, nasty little men, who run around pinning tags on people. This one is red, this one is a Jew. Since when has America become a race of snoopers? I mean, just magnificent. So we're dropping down on these people that I don't think these anecdotes I don't think I've heard. Was there one that took you by surprise?
Yeah, a lot of the work for this, but the most fun part of this crazy book was stuff that I didn't know. And of course, like, just to be clear, like, when women and people of color entered the academy in the 1960s and 70s, they turned everything upside down. I mean, they found archives and found stories and did research and assembled massive quantitative data and recovered like this whole world of meaning and experience that then when someone like me comes along to try to write, there's a huge, this huge, incredible literature to draw on to find those stories. There was a ton of, like, I get obsessed with people when I find them interesting, like Pauli Murray, I got completely fascinated by. Incredibly important legal mind in the 20th century, equally as important as Thurgood Marshall and not as written about. She essentially came up with a way to reinterpret, to realize the promise of the 14th Amendment, both for racial and sexual equality. She was also a woman who took male hormones and lived a very complicated life as a woman, kind of reimagining what that meant and wrestling with that. Totally fascinating 20th century character.
What year is this?
She's about the contemporary of Marshall, yeah. Yes. Great friends of Eleanor Roosevelt. I guess some of the people I got really fascinated by weren't necessarily heroic to me, but they were just like crazy how I didn't know about them. Like Mary Lease was a populist orator, probably other than William Jennings Bryan, who was known as Mr. Fundamentalist, and people know his name because he ran for president many times. Mary Lease was like the most famous populist orator. She was a poor Kansas farmer's wife She had like 6 children. She paid attention to what was going on in the world by cutting up the newspaper and gluing it to the walls of her mud house in the prairies of Kansas while she was just, doing basically washing. And somehow that really spoke to me. But she becomes a reporter for Pulitzer's newspaper. She is encouraged to run for the Senate from Kansas. She's a really important suffragist. She's much derided in American history. She's also incredibly anti-Semitic and is somewhat villainous in many ways. But she's completely fascinating and had this huge influence at the time. I mean, she was known all over the country, and she toured all over the West, inciting people to the populist cause.
It's so big. There's so much. How did you decide? Like, if you met somebody else like her, how do you not put that in? I mean, how did you decide?
Yeah, no, that was really hard. I mean, I like, you would want to put it's just like, but you don't want it to be an encyclopedia or a catch-all. So the decision is always, the book is chiefly a history of ideas. At the end of the day, like, this is a nation that is founded on an idea, that we are all created equal, that we consent to be sovereign over ourselves, and that we have natural rights, and our rights to one another are equal, and they will be guaranteed by the nation. Like, this is an incredibly complicated set of ideas, and the book has to explain where those ideas come from, and then look at how people have engaged with those ideas and challenged them, or realized the promise of them. So anybody that I was going to spend time on had to deliver an idea. So I was looking for people who would be really, because maybe this doesn't happen for you, but like for me, if it's a complicated idea, I really need someone who has like 6 fingers and always wears bow ties and went bald when he was 21. Like, I need some details about the guy who had the idea. And then I'll remember, oh, that was Marx. Or, what, Marx didn't have 6 fingers. I'm just like, but like, I need a character to, like, I can staple the idea to the character. And then when I need to remember socialism again, I'm like, oh my God, Eugene Victor Debs. Like, the guy ran for prison, and his campaign slogan was "From the jailhouse to the White House." Like, I will never forget Eugene V. Debs because of that detail. And I also like about Debs, he was really tall, but he was a socialist and believed in equality, so he always hunched over. Which is like, and who, like, some very tall men who are kind of like egalitarian, like they slope down because they just don't like towering over people. Anyway, I will remember socialism when I remember that. So
now I will too.
so that's what I chose. Like, people. So there's not a lot of people who kind of sit in their study and have great thoughts and can't attach something interesting to them, or people who are flashy and colorful, but they didn't really have an idea that matter, or that my reader needs to know about. So it's sort of like your oak tag, like you cut out this little character and you staple it to the idea.
I love it. I'm going to have to do that, like just have the character come. By the way, I got a little distracted because I looked out and there was the T. And there's everybody on the T looking in here. And the next time it comes by, we're going to all turn around and wave. Okay? I'm just like, oh, hi.
We could do like the duck tour thing and try to make them quack.
It was so cool. Okay. So we're going through time. We're going through time. Let's go to page 727. We're now 727. We're in the 1990s, and we're witnessing a very different revolution. The Silicon Valley entrepreneur. You've got Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, 2004, just 2004. And suddenly, I feel like we're back where we started, because you write one of the first casualties of this disruptive innovation. That was a good thing. Just be disruptive. And one of the first casualties was the paper newspaper, which is the thing that our forefathers rolled the Constitution up in to get that out. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I will say I think I kept a pretty even keel up until page 727. Do you know what I mean? Like, I was trying to write a book that didn't have a partisan position, that wasn't ideological, that was just like, here's a really good, listen to the story. Everybody can read this. Is for all of us. And I got to that disruptive innovation moment, and and I think I lost my keel a little bit, because this is why historians try not to write about the recent. It's hard to write about recent passed. But I think what strikes me about that moment, and struck me, to be fair, at the time, was the weird combination of heedlessness and gleefulness with which these people were destroying institutions that the grown-ups all understood were essential for our political well-being. And that, like, there was some guy who had a webpage that was like the newspaper Death Watch, and every time another newspaper went under in those years, like, it'd be posted, and it'd be like, ha ha ha, these old fogies at the legacy media organizations, like, don't get it, like, we were all, this is a whole new world. And we have actually been here before where there was technological utopianism, and people said, you know what, this isn't really going to necessarily solve what you think it's going to solve. So it was hard to write about that moment, because I don't think it is the job of the historian to sit in moral judgment on the living and the dead. I don't. But it is the job of us as citizens to evaluate one another's political behavior. And that became a little bit complicated for me in there.
Well, and this is where I want to do a mashup with your recent New Yorker piece. And this is, which issue is it? What's the cover? I'm trying to remember, because I printed it out.
It's 2 issues ago?
Yeah, 2 issues ago. And in this piece, you and your siblings, 4 of you, are sitting on the wood-paneled tailgate of a 1972 Oldsmobile station wagon. The tailgate's dangling as you write, like a broken
Do you guys remember that? It's like the tailgate that flopped down, it was called a clamshell? Yeah.
It's a wobbly bench for 4 kids, 8 legs swinging, every Sunday before dawn, yanked out of bed to stuff the cars way back, right? You called it the way back, with stacks of twine-tied papers, writing around time, delivering the papers with your father. It was the Worcester Sunday Telegram. And he would bark at you, go get the payment from them, and you would go in and get the payment. Talk about that moment and where you decided, and why you decided to leap from there to where you went.
Yeah. Well, the assignment was to write about a bunch of new books about the future of journalism, and that all begin with the turn to digital. That all kind of sort of really start in the 90s. There's a new book by the longtime editor of The Guardian, Alan Rusbridger, and this new Jill Abramson book, and there's a fantastic book by Matt Pressman, who got his PhD here at BU, on liberalism in the press.
I'm just going to jump in to say that Jill Abramson was just here this week, a fantastic evening with David Folkenflik, and there was news today. She's been accused of plagiarizing some of the paragraphs. Many of us who've looked closely at it feel that it's a problem of notation, refer to Doris Kearns Goodwin, and so we're going to see how that was the news of the day.
So anyway, my assignment was to write about these books, which were really about the last 20 years. But I knew really early on that what I wanted to do was offer a longer history on the daily newspaper, because I wanted, generationally, I think people that haven't grown up with, the quite delightful thing of sitting around the breakfast table, fighting over the sports section to see with the Red Sox box score, people don't even have never had that. A lot of, we live in a different world. And
I can remember on Long Island getting the press, Long Island Press and Newsday. One was long and one was short.
Yeah.
And then in the afternoon you get the second editions.
Yeah. So we used to get the Evening Gazette in Worcester. So I wanted to try to evoke that, like the dailiness and the rhythm of that, along with the really important part of the history of journalism that is often forgotten, which is that most journalists in radio and television, since the dailies started in the 1820s and 30s, got their training on a daily paper, on a local daily paper. Like, you would start out, writing for the Worcester Telegram, and maybe you'd go on to work for the Washington Post, but you always started out in your Pittsfield, whatever. Like, you'd start out on a local paper. Like, that's how you learned how to report, and you learned how to work with an editor. So that just made me think a lot about. Both my parents died a few years ago, and we delivered the paper. I didn't write about this in the essay, but my dad actually wrote a regular column for the Clinton Daily Item. No one's from Clinton here. And
you read it.
And my mom was the advertising manager for the West Boylston Banner, which was the next over paper.
That's wonderful.
Like, we all had like a paper, like it was a town. Like, everybody had some relationship to the town paper. And I wanted to tell the story about delivering the paper because of the opportunity to help a reader who had never had a daily paper come to their house know what a kind of social glue that was. I mean, I'm not saying like newspapers weren't fantastic or something, like it's not a past golden, but there's something about not only the local news where like you're gonna look and see like the kid on the high school football team that you know is his pictures in there, like there's a lot of just like localness to it, but the knocking on their doors and seeing how they're doing and meeting their dogs, like there's a kind of gluey, sticky community piece to that daily newspaper that we forget.
Well, and it gets pretty deep pretty fast. You quote the editor-in-chief of The Guardian, who says, "We are for the first time in modern history facing the prospect of how societies would exist without reliable news." You trace it for us, came Craigslist, for instance, choking off ad revenue from the local papers, killing off the papers. Then you had the online news aggregators, Huffington Post, Breitbart News. Remember, early on, they were just aggregators. You read the New York Times, maybe it was the Post, but the New York Times, I think, had a huge investigative piece. Huffington Post takes it, steals it, puts their own version on faster. They're not doing the reporting. At that time, they were not doing the reporting. They were aggregating.
Yeah.
And there's a whole swath. I mean, this is kind of, we're going over, kind of well-trod ground here. But there's a whole swath of people who deliver news who don't report it themselves. They just aggregate it and get it from somewhere else and don't know the difference.
Right. And I think it's tough to know the difference. It's made hard to know the difference. I mean, when I was working on this, I sat down with some teenagers I know and looked at BuzzFeed News' website, and I said, "Can you show me everything that's on this page that is an advertisement?" And they all could point out the display ads, like the big picture of whatever, the Tide or whatever it is. But none of them, even, the articles on BuzzFeed are in the very same font that say paid promotion, and their ads would be like, "Everybody's vacationing in Jamaica this year." And none of these teenagers could tell that was like none of them listed those things as ads. Like they didn't even like it's very it's made difficult to be a conscientious consumer of news. It's made difficult on purpose. But the reason, in some ways, it seems like, oh, why revisit this? We all know how horrible this whole story is. Craigslist was so long ago, and the consolidations and all the closings and the layoffs and the downsizing of the news stuff. But we still haven't reckoned with it, and all the digital media organizations are suffering now too, right? Like having taught people not to pay for news. Now BuzzFeed News laid off, I don't know how many people, 2 weeks ago. Yeah. Huffington Post did not make a profit last year.
Oops.
And they don't even pay their writers hard. There's just a lot of the crisis is now in the new media as well.
Well, it goes further than that. It's and I see your computer scientist husband sitting there. He's
to blame for this?
Well, no. I'm saying, well, you just told me he helped explain a lot of it to you, right? But it's out of our control. It's automated.
Yeah, and that's one of the arguments that I made. The last chapter of the book, which is when you get to that page 727, is called America Disrupted, and it begins with 9/11 and it ends with Election Day in 2016. And what it argues is that the previous chapter, which runs from 1974 to 2000, we see how the parties have become extremely polarized, especially around the issues of guns and abortion, and the particular work that is done by a generation of really dedicated political consultants of both parties to pull the parties apart and to really polarize them over these emotional issues that have constitutional fragility to them. And that's kind of where you get to 2000 and the Bush v. Gore moment. But what happens from 2001 to 2016 is that polarization is automated. So through these forms of political communication, but especially through social media. So it's one thing when you live in a polarized world. It's another thing when you live in a polarized world where you have no access to the mechanisms by which polarization is taking place.
Well, it's one thing when William Kristol, the conservative, decides after Watergate with Roger Ailes and others to go off and form their own media, which they did. Mm-hmm. And then it's another thing when even they lose control of that to Russian bots.
Yeah.
So what do we do? What do you, as you who've gone through history here, I can hear someone saying to you, oh, it can't be worse than when the telegraph came or when radio came and threatened, or or all these changes in media. What does history tell us about this?
I was thinking recently, this isn't in the book, but I'm working on something lately that was leading me to my latest obsession was with this organization that was started, I think in 1937 at Columbia, called the Institute for Propaganda Analysis. And they were basically run out of business during the Second World War because all their colleagues were like, we need propaganda. But what happens is, to get the American public to support the U.S. entry into the First World War, Woodrow Wilson establishes the Committee on Public Information, and he hires a journalist named George Creel to run it, and it's a propaganda organization. It's the first official propaganda ministry, essentially, in the United States. And they're using the methods of the early public relations world of Edward Bernays, and they do pretty nefarious work trying to convince Americans to support the war. And they also throw a lot of people in prison, including Eugene Debs, who opposed the war. And after the First World War, between the two world wars, a lot of Americans are like, what are we going to do about propaganda? Like, we just fought this war that people aren't even really sure the U.S. ever should have been involved in. And really, the electorate didn't really feel like it made an informed decision about. So people are really panicked about propaganda in the 1920s, and then much more panicked in the 1930s because they look at fascism in Europe. I mean, Hitler has a minister of propaganda who's using Bernays' research to convince the German people to invade us, whatever. And so there are a lot of American intellectuals who say, like, we are living in a world of fake news. Like, no one knows what's true anymore. And radio is making it, is incredibly intimate. Like, here's this machine in your kitchen that, like, is programs right into your head. And it's going to tell you what to think. Like, this is actually how fascism is working in Germany. What are we supposed to do about it? So, if NPR had been NPR in the 1930s, it would be doing what a lot of the quite heroic radio journalists of the 1930s did, which was use the medium to ask Americans to think harder about what they were hearing on the radio. So there are all these debate programs, like this America Town Hall of the Air, which is a little bit like this, where they would have this big forum at a lecture hall, and they'd have a bunch of people debate live on the air, and then people in the audience would ask questions. They'd have a big debate about, like, should we have universal health care or something, which is one of the debates they had in the 1930s. So there are a lot of American radio programmers who were trying to counter propaganda by helping educate the listening public into, this is a medium that you can be in conversation with, like the way you could be in conversation, you read the newspaper at the breakfast table and have an argument with somebody. And the Institute for Propaganda Analysis was trying to do that as well. But then World War II comes along, and FDR was like, no, we actually now need another propaganda ministry. And that moment is sort of lost. But there is, I think, there's something really powerful about that moment that I think bears further scrutiny as a moment when there is a lot of instability that's technologically driven, but it's also politically driven about what is true and what is not true, and how we can. I mean, that's when fake news becomes a thing like that. Fake news is what the German broadcasts are called by the British and the Americans. So I wouldn't say we have been in exactly this place before, but I do think there are moments in American history and in the history of the world that offer lessons.
Yeah. Well, come back now to the end of your New Yorker piece, where you take us to newsrooms that have, I can't remember what that's called, chart busters or something, where chart beat, where editors can see at every single second what people are reading, and this drive to respond to a president's tweets, and how we are changing, push notifications on news, or Facebook deciding, hey, it would be a good idea to only provide people with the news they want. Mm-hmm. This change in how we've done everything. And then you come to a screeching halt. Oh wait, I want to mention The Correspondent. This is a Dutch website, The Correspondent, trying to unbreak the news. They're not going to run ads, they're not going to collect data, they're not going to have subscribers. They don't want to pay more attention to the sensational, exceptional, negative, recent, and incidental, and lose sight of the ordinary, usual, positive, historical, and systematic. I mean, I think I want to know more about that. Yeah. But then you just come to a screeching halt, and suddenly we're back with you in the way back, with the back of the car, delivering the Worcester Sunday Telegram. You're all sitting. I'm thinking, oh my God, this would happen now. Your father would be in the front page of the Herald. You're holding onto the back there, screaming at it, "Dad, don't go so fast," because you're barely, hanging on there. And suddenly, you're knocking on people's doors, collecting for the paper, and suddenly you're at a neighbor's. Can you read this last paragraph? You've said it's not the role of the historian to comment, to judge news, but suddenly we're here. And I want you to read this and then tell us why we went there.
Okay. The other thing I would say is that, did anybody have a paper route? Your kids? Okay.
My brother did, and I did it.
I got a lot of email after this from people who have paper routes. But the thing is, like, it was after you delivered the paper, like sometimes people would leave the money out, but if they didn't leave the money out, you had to go ask for the money, and it was kind of a pain, mainly because people would invite you in, and then they would need you would help. They would need your help. Or they'd want to visit with you. They'd like sit you down and give you cookies, and it would just take all day. And we had a Sunday paper, and my dad was like a lapsed Catholic, and his whole thing was, this is your Catholic service. You will go into these homes and you will do whatever anybody needs you to do, because this is how you are a good person in the world. Like, so people they would specifically not leave out the money, because they'd be like, oh, one of the Lepore kids is going to come over, and I could get them to return my library books on their bike after they pick. Like, it would just be a thing. And I really respected my dad for his, wisdom in knowing that is actually what was really going on. So this paragraph I'm going to read is in the context of my realization that, that was the thing that the paper did. The death of a newspaper is sometimes like other deaths. The Mrs. and the Miss, a very, very old woman and her very old daughter, lived in a crooked greenhouse on top of a rise and wore matching housecoats and slippers. The Miss followed the Mrs. around like a puppy. The Mrs. would be poring over the opinion pages, while the Miss cut pictures out of the funnies. The Miss can't think straight, my father said. Her head's scrambled, so be gentle with her. Nothing to be afraid of. Be sure to help them out. Once when I biked over there, the Miss was standing, keening. Noise without words, sound without sense. The Mrs. wasn't moving, and she wasn't ever going to move again. I called for help and held the Mrs. hand, waiting for the wail of sirens. I didn't know what else to do.
I mean, that's the end of the piece.
Thank you.
That floored me, because for the previous several pages we've been reading about Facebook and Zuckerberg and people trying to gin up responses and newspapers dying, and suddenly we're back there in Worcester, and that's really what it's all about.
Yeah, and I wanted there to be a space for grief, and also I had a whole debate about with my editor about whether I could end that way, and I said, especially the last line, I didn't know what else to do. I said, because he was like, I'm not sure what that means. He's brilliant. I'm not questioning him, but he was like, tell me what that means. And I said, well, I think that it's worth making a space in the piece for helplessness. I feel really overwhelmed with helplessness about this particular set of losses. And it's almost like we mock people who miss the daily paper somehow, as if it's so old-fashioned, but it's not. It's because it stands for something else. It's not just about the reporting. It's about a lot of other things that feel gone.
Jill Lepore. Now, you were there all by yourself with the missus on the floor. I mean, it was. So we, of course, want you to be able to ask some questions of your own, and we have 2 microphones here. And I see, is that Amy and Alex? Please say hello to Alex, who's going to be one of the people running this CitySpace for us. You know Amy as well. Yay, Alex, who's come. You can ask any questions of him, but any questions for Jill Lepore? Just come on up to the mic.
Okay.
You can stay there. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. This was just so spectacular. And Jill, I'm about 500 pages into your book.
Yay!
Robin, you asked a question, I think earlier on, one of your first questions was, why do we not know these stories that are in Jill's book? And I felt the same way. I mean, I'm reading it. I grew up in Virginia. I felt like I was spoon-fed a version of history that just isn't true. And I feel like reading your book is the first time I'm learning American history. And I think it conjures for me a bigger question about how the Academy of Historians looks at what is taught in our schools. My feeling is that your book should be required reading for everybody in the entire country. I just wonder if you could address that issue, and how do we move your history forward?
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I was actually asked originally by my publisher to write a textbook, a college student textbook, and I said, okay, I guess I should do that. Like, I've been asked before, and I've always said no, because I'm sorry, but like writing a textbook sounds pretty bad to me. But I thought, all right, it's time, I should probably do that. Like, that's an obligation to the profession. I should do that. But I said, I'll do that second, because first I want to write a U.S. history book, because there just isn't. And I think there's probably a market for that. Like, I think people maybe are hungry for that. Like, it's 1,000 pages in a world where we read 140 characters or I don't know. Like, it's a lot to ask, but its argument is some things actually take 1,000 pages. Like, some things are important enough to take 1,000 pages, and even if it takes a long time. So it is going to be a college textbook, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about why we're in this particular situation, just as a teacher, and also as, like, you know, I have 3 kids, I watch them go through school. And one of the things that's weird about U.S. history teaching is that in the younger grades, like, U.S. history is taught here in Massachusetts in, I think, it's like 3rd, 5th, and 8th grade, and then you have it in high school. And some of the stuff is really hard to teach like the moral ambiguity, the story of slavery and Jim Crow, they're hard things to teach, and there's a lot of political will to not teach them. But when you think about that, it's an incredible act of violence to not teach them for all the kids in those rooms that are the descendants of people, who are immigrants who were shut out, who dealt with segregation in ways that were painful to their family, like who are descended from native peoples who were forcibly removed from their homes, like, so they don't get to have a history. Like the presumption that it's too painful to tell a true story is just a wrong presumption, and it's a very upsetting thing to encounter among school children. I remember I tell this story all the time. I probably told this to you, Robin, but I was visiting a Cambridge public school a few years ago, and the kids were studying the American Revolution. It was kindergarten, and they had this incredible teacher in this great room, and they were like decorated with all this stuff, and they had like Declaration of Independence and all these like cutout heads of different people, and the kids had to do, like, they had to be somebody for like the school like little recital-y thing, and I was like, who are you guys being? And it was like Ben Franklin and Patrick Henry and on and on and on. And I said, well, are any of you being women? And they said no. And I said, they looked at me like I had lobsters coming out of my ears. And they said no. And I said, well, why? And this one little girl with like these adorable little cornrow braids, cute as can be, like smart as a whip. She stands up and she says, because there were no women then. And that was the right answer. Like, that's the world that she had been studying. It's a perfectly plausible explanation. But you move that through the whole of the society, and then you have this world where people don't have any sense that there are more experiences than their own. So I do think there are real consequences. And I do actually think historians are to blame. School teachers, in my view, are not to blame. I think actually academic historians are to blame.
And maybe book publishers. Because one of the biggest publishers of school books is based in Texas. It's a very conservative country, and we come across this a lot. You know, you have to get by them too. So, another question.
Thank you. I enjoyed this talk very much. Both my husband and I are from Israel, and I used to work for Haaretz Daily, which is pretty similar to NPR in the mindset. One of the things that fascinated me that you had talked about is the aggregate. And working in the foreign news desk, one of the things that was very hard for me to decipher some of the times was, who am I getting this news from? This guy it says AP, Reuters, and whatever. It's not that different from the aggregates you were talking about, you know, for Huffington Post or BuzzFeed. How would you reconcile that kind of issue? Because if there is a guy sitting in Afghanistan writing to Reuters in very botched English, how do I know that's true or not true? How do I vet that? It's not always that clear cut. And I think now standing in the world, we're kind of like, oh, they don't know or whatever. And sometimes it is real. So I've just...
Yeah. No, I totally appreciate that problem. And I'm sorry that I don't have a magical solution for you. I really recommend the Alan Rusbridger book, which starts... The Guardian guy. I forget the name of the book. But it starts with this long story about a story being published in Swedish newspapers, in like the most prominent Swedish daily, about immigrants to Sweden attacking young girls. I'm sorry, this is going to be upsetting, raping them and then setting their genitals on fire. And so it's reported in the newspaper, and he follows it back to its original source. It's complete fiction. But the path by which it got from some insane, anti-immigration person posts this thing that then gets somewhat like upscaled and cleansed by the next poster who has slightly more legitimacy. And then they're like, oh, the next person up is like, that's kind of legitimate, but that's a really big story. And then it moves up this ladder to, by the time it gets to, the equivalent of the Haaretz, like no one's figured out where it came from. And the chain is actually incredibly difficult to reconstruct. Like you can tell that Rusbridger took a long time to do this work, to figure out how did this thing move? Like where did it originally come from? And then even after it's clear that it's a lie, how do you even undo that? Like there's no unwinding that, going back. It's out there, and people that want to believe that are going to believe it, even if you publish a retraction. So I think it is really, it is like the question, and he wants to offer some answers. But among the problems that he's casting light on, that Abramson herself casts light on, is the bad information is free, and the good information costs money, and most people don't have a lot of money, and they're going to get the bad information. That it's a form of, it's a manifestation of our widening income inequality. It's yet another form of asymmetry that is skewing our politics. So people will be like, how could you believe that? But it's like, because I don't have the money to buy that. I'm getting this stuff for free. And that's one of the points of the information or the correspondent, which is basically following an NPR model. It's like, look, news is a public good. We can't charge people for it. We need to actually make it available to people for free, but it costs a lot of money to do it well. So we're going to have a membership model, and we're going to count on people like you good people to make it possible for this to be excellent. And one of the things we're going to do along the way is actually explain what we do, because people don't understand how much money it takes to do what Robin does, like to do what all the reporters at WBUR do. Like it's an extraordinarily expensive endeavor. And so part of like the move that WBUR and NPR and all like you see ads on TV for the Washington Post now, they're trying to explain how much work it takes. And so that's a remedy that people are offering. I have another kind of beef about that, which is there are tools that humanists use to evaluate the truth claim, the truth of claims, and their rules of evidence and forms of discernment that have evolved over centuries. And we are very busy spending all of our money on STEM education, which actually isn't equipping people to do what you want to do. But if we were actually doing a better job teaching the humanities and how we, as humans, evaluate evidence is a big question in humanistic inquiry, we would be better equipped. So I think there's a righting of that balance that needs to happen as well. I have another question.
Thank you very much, and of course I enjoyed your book very much. One of the themes that I kept seeing was the waxing and waning of similar ideas across the arc of American history, like abolition, suffrage, the value of government. I'm not an historian, but a physician, and one of the surprising things I took out of your book was the waxing and waning of the idea of health care for everybody, which to my surprise, I think appeared first in California in the 30s and then was resurrected in the Truman era, appeared again in the 70s. I'm wondering if you could speak to the idea of whether or not in the United States, the idea that we are or are not our brother's keepers, what the status of that concept is nowadays.
Yeah. Thanks. That's a really big question. We could have a great community conversation about that, right? So the idea of a government-provided health care or health insurance is even earlier. It's really the 19-teens, which is when the sort of social welfare state in Europe, like when England adopts a national health care program, and the break on the movement to a national health care program in the 19-teens is twofold. One, it's constitutionally challenging, as of course Obamacare was and remains somewhat constitutionally challenging because of the direct taxes problem. But two, it is identified in the 19-teens by people who oppose it with Germany. And so once the First World War starts, people who want to, which is mainly like prototypes of the AMA and the AMA, and even in the 19-teens, they will say that this is Germanism, and then after it's Bolshevism after the Bolshevik Revolution. So it's sort of a casualty of xenophobia, but it just makes the bar higher to deal with the constitutional issue, which could have been dealt with. What happens in the 1930s and then in the 1940s and 50s is just a coalition of businessmen, but especially the AMA, hire the first political consulting firm in the United States to defeat Truman's national health care proposal, have the same people that defeated the state health care proposal in California that Earl Warren had put forward. I mean, I think it is really important to see that history stretched out and see that progression of defeats. And I find it really heartbreaking actually to watch Warren and Truman watch those defeats. So Earl Warren, who had grown up really poor, worked on the railroad as a kid, right after he's elected governor of California, or soon after that, he has this terrible kidney infection and he nearly dies. And he's a conservative, he's somewhat of a conservative Republican, but he has this kind of, if I didn't have resources, I would have died. I had to pay a lot of money for this care. And so he proposes this California state health insurance. And he's defeated by these people who are just a political enemy of his. And he's just blindsided. They cannot believe, because when he announces it in his State of the State, the whole state's like, that's a great idea, let's do that. And the same thing happens to Truman. And he kind of just says at the end, I don't know how in the Sam hell they did it, but they actually took a country that was completely supportive of this and undid the support. So it's really about, maybe it's partly about your view of human nature. Are people good and we consider ourselves to be part of a common weal, and then private interests exert themselves very hard to persuade us that that's not the case? Or do people not have that sense of a common weal and they're very easily convinced that there isn't one? I don't have a big kind of theory of history to offer for you there. I just think there's always going to be a battle over issues like healthcare. And if you think about the vacuum of moral authority over climate change, that we don't, that we live in a world in which we're not every day actually being asked to think about sacrifice, to save our world, is just bizarre. I myself find that bizarre. It seemed like a much bigger version of the healthcare story to me.
I think we're going to have time for one more. Do we have one more question? Yeah.
Jill and Robin, I've really enjoyed listening to you talk about the impact of how all of these changes in how information's perceived by people over the range. It made me think while you were talking about this concept that we're in this world of an expanding velocity of information coming at us. And I'd just be interested in your perspective on the impact you think that has in our ability to both consume the information and actually adequately process it.
Yeah. I wrote a very brief essay once for the New Yorker called Yesterday's News that was thinking about this question of acceleration of communication in a longer view. Because that's always my question, like, okay, we are getting information faster than the speed of thought. That seems to be a problem. But when did that happen? Like, when did we get into that point? And I got obsessed with certain markers. Like, there was a really weird moment in 1939, right after Felix Frankfurter, who had been teaching at Harvard Law School, joined the Supreme Court. And he got really mad because the Times was having someone transcribe the opinions of the court when they were issued on Monday and printing them in the Times newspaper the next day. And he was like, that's too fast. Like that, how can we, like, we need to actually, like, the people in the room need to absorb that. Like, we need to diffuse this information more slowly. Like, we don't, like, it was kind of unraveled by the idea that, like, you could find out what the Supreme Court thought had decided the next day. So it's not like we're the first people to ever say the news is coming at us too fast. It's the quantity, and it is, I'm just going to take a minute.
Please.
The thing that is most significant to me is the lack of purposeful selection. So I always ask my students, it's 1957. Of everything that is published on this day in 1957, newspapers, magazines, books, everything that's on television, on the radio, how much of that has been reviewed by an editor or a team of editors who are asking a bunch of questions? Is this fair? Is this newsworthy? Is this in the public interest? Is there missing information? And we eventually come down to, like, except for the live broadcasting of the Red Sox game, like, everything has been through an editor. Everything. Really everything. And now we're like, it's 2019. Of everything published today, which is all the newspapers, magazines, books, television, radio, cable television, every blog, every tweet, everything that's posted online, everything on Facebook, any social media thing, how much of that has been through an editor? Someone or a team of editors, people whose job it is to say, is this fair? Is this actually a story? Is it in the public interest? Is there missing information? Do we all need to offer more context? And I don't know, like, what do you?
I would say, I mean, Charlie, I'm looking over to Charlie too. I would say it's like 20%.
So I would say like less than 1%. If you think of all the tweeting and all the social media posting and the Instagrams, like everything that is public, everything that is made public, I think it's infinitesimal. And there are problems with that world of editors. Like, they missed a lot of important stories. We didn't know enough about, we didn't know enough about lynching. Like, there's a whole lot you could say that's unfair about that.
Blindness.
But there was a selection that is made for you that allows you to participate in a political community with some sense that the people around you have access to information that has been responsibly presented to you. I mean, that is, just to finish off here, that is why we are here in this room, because that is really important.
And I just want to say, and it's going to give a little bit of a prop to my show Here and Now, but just a little one, because a lot of people don't understand in public radio. First of all, WBUR has a phenomenal newsroom, the largest in Boston radio, and they're just incredible. But when you start thinking about the national programs, a lot of people don't know that Terry Gross, who we love, is a public radio program, but she's not an NPR program. Stations that carry NPR carry Terry Gross, but she makes that program editorially all by herself. The same is true of On Point, all of the programming that you hear. Here and Now is the only program in public radio that is actually a co-production of NPR News in Washington. So just like Morning Edition is produced through NPR, and just like All Things Considered is produced through NPR, Here and Now is produced with NPR. We have producers sitting there in our morning meeting, and they are involved with everything that we do. I mean, we come up with all the ideas, and we're a real engine, but it filters through there. And there is attention. because we have TV, they consider us, I'm not exactly a spring chicken. They consider us like this fast-moving thing that's happening that, we have TVs everywhere and we're constantly, taking in social media. And we are now working with NPR, and I promise you that the care that they give to, when they go with something and how they go with something. And I know this because sometimes I've been frothing at the mouth to do something, and the editors at NPR will say, no, we have not confirmed that yet. And that's rare. That's rare. And of course it's a good thing. It's a wonderful thing. And it's, who cares if I chafe at the bit? I mean, the fact is that that's the way it should be done. You're not putting something on the air till you're absolutely sure of it. But you're right, it's probably less than 1%. Everything that gets thrown on the air. But we get to see firsthand, so I can promise you and I can guarantee you, and I can clench my teeth sometimes when it happens, that they will wait until, not the next day, but until they're sure of the news, so it's quality news. And I'm not just telling you this story because tomorrow we begin our Valentine's Day fundraiser here at 1-800-909-9287. Jill Lepore, former volunteer at the fundraiser. And all of you, there's coffee, there's dessert, there's books, and Jill will be here. Thank you so much.